from Dark Arisen to Dragon's Dogma Online, and finally Dragon's Dogma 2. The 9 vocations available to us in the sequel have gone through a massive transformation, and to understand the impact these changes have in combat, we have to revisit both Dark Arisen and the online version of the game to get the full picture. In this video, we'll take a closer look at the evolution of every vocation. We'll cover the vocations that didn't make it into the sequel and why they were removed, as well as reviewing the new vocations and how they have implemented these playstyles in combat. But first, I want to frame this video by talking about the structure of vocations through these 3 games, as well as the different stat gain progression and level caps. In Dark Arisen, the vocations available to us was divided into 3 categories: basic, advanced, and hybrid vocations. The basic vocations like fighter, strider, and mage would be well-rounded classes that could take on most situations with an even distribution of stats across the board. Advanced vocations, on the other hand, would be specialized classes that would often sacrifice defense for maximum offense. These classes would also receive a higher stat gain for their respective archetypes: physical damage for warrior, magic for sorcerer, and stamina for ranger. The third category of classes was the hybrid vocations. These were unique classes that would combine elements from the basic vocations to create new archetypes. Magic archers would wield a special bow that shoots elemental magic. Mystic Knights would combine the defense of fighter with elemental magic buffs and spells, and the assassin would become a weapons master, able to wield 4 different weapon classes at all times, with the highest strength gain among all vocations and access to an incredibly powerful augment called autonomy that would boost your strength and magic damage by 70% when playing solo. This vocation was certainly a force to be reckoned with, and it therefore became a fan favorite for min-maxers and players wanting the absolute best damage output at higher levels. The reason for this was the way your character would gain stats according to the vocation used when leveling up. This system was flawed in many ways, but it also made sense in an RPG setting. The problem would often be that players level, let's say, assassin for most of their playthrough, gaining a high strength stat at the cost of low magic. When wanting to try out the sorcerer vocation later in your run, you would find yourself at a disadvantage. But eventually, min-maxing would become less meaningful when Bitter Black Island was added and higher tiers of equipment were introduced. Most people would beat the main game around level 50, and the magic stat difference between a sorcerer and assassin would be around 150 points. At this point in the game, we would have access to weapons dealing well over 1000 magic damage, meaning over 80% of our damage output would come from our weapon, and a pure sorcerer build would only deal 10% more damage than a pure assassin build in this scenario. However, this stat gain progression would undergo a massive transformation, both in Dragon's Dogma Online and in the sequel. Your level cap in Dark Arisen was 200, which was already very high, and most players wouldn't come anywhere close to reaching this level, even with a good amount of grinding. In the online version of the game, they reduced the level cap to 120, but leveling up to max level here would require a total of 226 million XP. That's 6 times higher than what was required to reach max level in Dark Arisen. The grindy nature of an MMO can justify this high level cap, but what's strange is that they decided to increase the level ceiling for our character even further in Dragon's Dogma 2. Here, the level cap would be 999, and it would require 267 million XP to get there. But interestingly, getting to level 200 in the sequel would require only 26 million, compared to the 36 million in Dark Arisen. So it seems they have stretched out the XP tables but made it easier to level up. The vocation structure we knew from Dark Arisen would also undergo a few changes. In Dragon's Dogma Online, they introduced 6 new classes, and in total there were 11 vocations that would be divided into 3 groups that represented their role in combat. Tanks would take aggro and provide defensive and elemental support. Attackers would deal melee damage and ranged DPS. And healers would aid the party with recovery and support magic. And the changes to the vocations we see in the sequel clearly drew inspiration from the online version of the game. Here they had already split the Strider vocation into the dagger-wielding Seeker and Hunter armed with only a bow and special arrows. Mage got transformed into the Priest vocation and got stripped of most of its offensive spells with a stronger focus on supportive magic. And Mystic Knight's role got split into Shield Sage that inherited its Great Shield and defensive prowess, and High Scepter took on the role of an advanced spell sword with ranged magic. The Alchemist and Spirit Lancer introduced two completely new playstyles that we didn't have access to in Dark Arisen. The Alchemist, being the most unique out of these two, would conjure alchemy with its magic gauntlet and introduced hand-to-hand combat to the series. Spirit Lancer would wield a new lance weapon and excel in both support and offensive abilities. The vocation structure in both Dark Arisen and Dragon's Dogma Online made sense in terms of color coding and grouping, but that would change again in Dragon's Dogma 2, where they partly returned to the structure seen in Dark Arisen. Here, we still got the red color for melee, blue for magic, and yellow for ranged vocations. But they also added a new green color for the Thief vocation. This would of course confuse most veterans of the game that naturally would expect an advanced and hybrid vocation for this new branch of color coding, introduced in the sequel. Furthermore, both the Fighter and Mage vocations would get advanced versions in Warrior and Sorcerer, as well as hybrids in the form of Magic Archer and Mystic Spearhand. There is also no consistency in the number of basic, advanced, and hybrid vocations here, and therefore, vocation theories within the community blossomed after the lineup of Dragon's Dogma 2 finally was revealed. So, now that we have a better understanding of the structure of vocations in these three games, let's take a closer look at each vocation and their transformation from Dark Arisen to Dragon's Dogma 2, starting with the Fighter. In Dark Arisen, fighters had access to 10 sword skills and 6 shield skills, and in combat we had a total of 6 skills available to us, plus 2 bonus skills activated with a delayed light attack and while holding down your heavy attacks. Since all the classes in Dark Arisen except Warrior could equip both the primary and the secondary weapon at the same time, our skill arsenal allowed for great versatility in combat. In Didion, fighters got access to only 12 skills, but in combat we had a total of 4 skills and 1 class-specific skill available for every vocation. But they also added a mechanic that would let us switch skill sets during combat. This would effectively increase our skill arsenal to a total of 9 skills available to us at all times, which was a huge step up from Dark Arisen. In the sequel, fighters have access to 12 skills, but in combat we now only have 4 skills available to us. Every vocation instead gets a class-specific skill that occupies what would previously activate your secondary weapon skills, effectively reducing our versatility in combat. And this core change to the vocations in Dragon's Dogma 2 would become one of the biggest letdowns for the community. A solution for this could be to simply add a mechanic to switch skill sets while holding down the R3 button, like in Dragon's Dogma Online. What's great about the Fighter in Dragon's Dogma 2 is its improved ability to pin down enemies with finishing moves and the Gouging Skewer skill. Counter Slash also improves the fighter's ability to avoid damage when surrounded, and core skills like Steeled Foundation and Toss, when holding down light attacks, are really nice additions. It's also cool that fighters now can riposte almost like the Mystic Knight when your shield is enchanted. I would say, although we have fewer skills available to us in combat this time around, they made the fighter feel more sturdy. It never felt better to play sword and board, and it's hands down one of my favorite classes to play in Dragon's Dogma 2. Another returning vocation is the Mage. In Dark Arisen, this class was responsible for healing and buffing the party with elemental magic. It had access to fire, ice, and lightning, as well as holy and dark magic. One spell that would be unique to this class was Grapnel. This spell fires a magical anchor that can bind a foe for a time. It was an incredibly powerful tool that could even pin down larger enemies for a period. In Didion, the priest would take on the role of healing the party, and this time around it would be stripped of most of its offensive spells, with a stronger focus on recovering the party and debilitating enemies. Priests were also one of the classes that could weaken enemy armor, which was an important mechanic in the online version of the game. in the sequel, the mage returned with some new tricks up its sleeve. You could now cast Anodyne to heal the party with the heavy attack button, giving us a total of 5 skills available in combat, and new skills like Palladium that blocks up to 3 attacks from enemies, Spell Hold to store an incanted spell in the staff to be cast instantly at the wielder's discretion, and Quick Spell to hasten incantation speed, allowing the mage to heal its party more efficiently. I think mages received some of the best improvements overall, and that would be crucial since mages are one of the most important players in any party and can turn the tides of battle even when the odds are stacked against us. And then we have Strider, and one of the most controversial changes to our vocation lineup. A recurring trend that started already in DD was that vocations became more specialized to better fit their role in party during combat. In Dark Arisen, many vocations would have overlapping skills, so this would make sense in an online version of the game where every member of the party should bring their own unique assets to combat. For this reason, the Strider vocation that could wield both a bow and daggers would get split into Seeker and Hunter in DD and then Thief and Archer in Dragon's Dogma 2. I think another reason for this division could be how the Strider vocation, in many situations, would make either the bow or daggers redundant in combat. Some of the bow skills were so powerful that one could simply snipe down most enemies at range, never really engaging in melee combat. Or, on the other hand, taking advantage of overpowered skills like Skull Splitter would, in many cases, outperform your bow skills. I would say these changes make sense, but let's take a closer look at the specialized Archer vocation in Dragon's Dogma 2. In the sequel, archers have the ability to track their targets automatically when firing without manually aiming. This mechanic, combined with the way we can slide when knocking an arrow while dashing, is what makes this vocation feel so good in combat. I personally think this is the best rendition of a bow class in any RPG so far. It's incredibly satisfying to freely dash around the battlefield, taking out targets in quick succession, without slowly aiming down like a first-person shooter. The only downside to this vocation is how special arrows are now locked behind a skill for every arrow type. But this limitation also makes sense, seeing how you in Dark Arisen could equip blast arrows and use them together with incredibly powerful skills like Tenfold Shot to just melt every boss in the game. Then we have the Thief vocation. This class inherited skills from both the Strider and Assassin vocation, and unfortunately they managed to make this class even more powerful than the first game. Not only do we have access to a dodge that costs no stamina, but infamous skills like Skull Splitter seems to be just as broken as before. On top of that, the Thief gets access to the most powerful Maester skills in the game, and it's available at the very start of the game. Formless Feint together with Blades of Tapire is such a powerful combo that it can single-handedly take down bigger enemies without any risk to the player. But having said that, this class is still incredibly fun to play and give a proper assassin feel to it. So although I'm not a fan of how some of these skills are balanced, the overall experience is still solid. The Warrior vocation have also gone through a massive transformation, from Dark Arisen, where it was without a doubt the most gimped class with only 3 skills available in combat, and jumping light attacks eventually became the best way to deal damage reliably. It was just a mess of a vocation, but this would change in DD where warriors, like the other classes, got access to 5 skills in combat, as well as a new mechanic that would allow us to tank damage that would fuel a rage meter that could be unleashed for massive damage. In the sequel, this skill returns, but now it will only stagger the targets and reduce incoming stagger, similar to Pummel Strike in the first game. Another welcome skill was the introduction of Chain of Blows. This attack employs the user's momentum to unleash additional attacks when timed correctly, greatly increasing the warrior's DPS potential. Sorcerers, on the other hand, got completely gutted in the sequel, and although this class benefits from the changes introduced for the mage vocation, it's just not as effective in combat with only 4 skills available. The reason for that is how important elemental variety is for this vocation. Preferably, every sorcerer should have at least 1 spell that can be used for crowd control, like Thundermine, 1 spell for DPS like Prescient Flare, and 1 spell from each of the elemental magics, plus 1 ultimate spell like Meteoron or Maelstrom. Since our heavy attack is already taken up by Galvanize, The Sorcerer sadly feels a bit underwhelming when compared to its Dark Arisen counterpart, where we had access to over 25 spells in our arsenal. Magic Archer have just like the Strider been stripped down of its dagger skills, focusing on ranged elemental damage, but with some added support skills this time around. It is for the most part a well-balanced vocation. I just wish we could access the class earlier in our playthrough. Then we have Mystic Spearhand, one of the 2 new vocations added in Dragon's Dogma 2. But although this class takes inspiration from its name brother, the Mystic Knight in Dark Arisen, this vocation don't really fill the Spellblade role in combat. In the first game, Mystic Knights would dish out elemental damage with its shield and riposte skills, and a magical cannon that would deploy a barrage of orbs infused with your current enchantment. In DD-on, the High Scepter would take on the role of a more offensive Spellblade, with access to a multitude of skills that would deal elemental damage. The Mystic Spearhand, however, plays more like a combination of a thief and fighter class, with evasive maneuvers and control over gravity, but it does have access to attacks that deal damage as well, like setting Storm and Magic Spear Gun, as well as its heavy attacks that shoots a magic projectile. As a standalone vocation, it's certainly an interesting addition to the sequel, but sadly falls short when trying to fill the niche Mystic Knights created in Dark Arisen. Lastly, we have the Trickster vocation, by far the most experimental class introduced to the series, and although the idea of this vocation looks good on paper, it's a shame that it completely fumbles to deliver a fun experience for players coming from Dark Arisen and the online version of the game. The fact that this is one of the only 2 new classes introduced in the sequel means that the community with good reason had big expectations to how this would play out in a combat-oriented game like Dragon's Dogma. Not having a means to attack enemies directly is frustrating, but skills like Dragon's Delusion, which creates an illusory dragon, could potentially deal damage, and that would completely change how you play this vocation. If we were given more skills that could summon illusory allies, that would be amazing. Maybe even let the smoke coming out of the sensor blind or damage enemies. There's so much potential for making this vocation great. And I just hope Capcom listens to the feedback from the community so far. I think they really nailed the fighter, mage and warrior vocations. And with time, hopefully Capcom and Kento Kenoshita can bring all of this together in an upcoming DLC.